Hi guys, happy Tuesday, happy Cinco de Mayo. Good to see you again, or read to you, I guess. I can't really see you. Anyway, I got a new book today, Mrs. Piggle Wiggles Magic, and I'd love to read it to you. If some of the pages don't have pictures, so what I will do is, on the pages that do, I'll show you the picture. Otherwise, we'll just go ahead and read. Let's get started. So this one's called Mrs. Piggle Wiggles Magic, and I loved this book when I was little. This is my favorite. So this is, I'm going to read one chapter per day, although the first chapter is just an introduction. So for today, I'll read 2, and then from there, I will read 1 chapter each day. Each chapter kind of has a little story by itself. So here we go. Mrs. Piggle Wiggles Magic, right there. Of course, the reason that all the children in our town like Mrs. Piggle Wiggle is because Mrs. Piggle Wiggle likes them. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle likes children. She enjoys talking to them, and best of all, they don't irritate her. When Molly O'Toole was looking at the colored pictures in Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's big dictionary and just happened to be eating a candy cane at the same time and drooled candy cane juice on the colored pictures of gems, and then forgot to shut the book so the pages all stuck together, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle didn't say, "Such a careless little girl can never ever look at colored pictures in my big dictionary again." Nor did she say, "You must never look at books when you're eating." She said, "Let's see, I think we can steam those pages apart, and then we can wipe the stickiness off with a little soap and water, like this. Now see, it's just as good as new. There's nothing as cozy as a piece of candy and a book. Don't look so embarrassed, Molly. I almost drool every time I look at those gems. Which one is your favorite? I think mine is the lapis lazuli." When Dickie Williams was showing off for Patsy by riding his wagon with his eyes shut and crashed through Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's basement window and landed in the coal bin, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle laughed so much that she had to sit down on the front steps and wipe her eyes with her apron. Dickie was awfully scared and was going to sneak out of the basement door and go home, but Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, still laughing, leaned through the broken window and said, "Hand me the putty knife and that can of putty off the shelf. Then go get me that pane of glass leaning against the wall over there by the furnace. Thank you very much. Now watch carefully, Dickie, because putting in window glass is something that every boy should know how to do, especially boys who ride wagons with their eyes closed." When Marilyn Matson, who was helping Mrs. Piggle Wiggle serve tea, dropped and broke her brown teapot, she said, "Well, that's the luckiest thing I've ever known. You didn't get a drop of hot tea on you. And you broke that nasty teapot with the leaky spout that I've hated for 15 years. Tomorrow I'll get to go to town and buy a new one. I think I'll get pink, and I'm going to test the spout before I buy it." "But what about the tea?" said Marilyn, wiping her eyes on her sleeve. "Make it in a coffee pot," Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said. "Then we can call it toffee." Another nice thing about Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, when a child makes her a present, no matter how splotchy or crooked it might be, she uses it and keeps it where everyone can see it. Johnny Wilfred made her a vase out of a meat sauce bottle with such a little neck that only flowers with stems like hairs would fit in. Not only that he had painted it a sort of a bilious green, and the paint was way too thick and ran down the sides in warty lumps. But Mrs. Piggle Wiggle loves Johnny, and she loves the warty vase because Johnny made it for her, and she keeps it on the windowsill above the sink with at least one flower gasping for breath jammed through its little neck. Every time Johnny comes into her kitchen, he points proudly to the vase and says, "Do you see that pretty vase over there on the windowsill? Well, I made it for Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. Didn't I, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle?" When Susan Gray came staggering over with a plate of the first cookies she'd ever made for Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle didn't take a look at the tannish gray lumps and say, "No, thank you." She said, "Why, Susan Gray, you smart girl, 8 years old and already making cookies. You're going to make somebody a fine wife." "Yeah, somebody with good teeth," said Hubert Prentice, who had taken one of the gray lumps and had found it trying to eat it was like biting on a stone. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle took the cookie away from him and said, "Oh, Hubert, these are special cookies. You dunk them in your tea and then take a bite." She hurried to the kitchen and made some tea, and then she and Molly and Hubert and Susan sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and gnawed at the stony cookies, which in addition to being hard as rocks, tasted like glue because Susan had put in gravy coloring instead of vanilla. When Molly and Hubert made gagging motions to each other, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle slipped them some ginger cookies under the table, and Susan was so proud that she didn't even notice. Julie Ward knitted Mrs. Piggle Wiggle a scarf that was about 10 yards long and 2 inches wide. And when Mrs. Piggle Wiggle opened the box, she didn't say, "Julie, you must have had a giraffe in mind when you made this scarf." Instead, she said, "You know, Julie, this is much too pretty to wear as a scarf and keep tucked inside my coat. I'm going to wear it as a sash." She took the long, dirty blue, wormy-looking scarf and wrapped it around her waist and looped the ends over, and it did look nice from a distance. Julie was so proud. She said, "You know, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, when I was making a scarf, I just thought to myself, now I'll make this longer, then Mrs. Piggle Wiggle can wear it as a belt too." Of course, she hadn't really. What actually happened was that she knitted on the scarf every afternoon when she listened to the radio, and she just forgot to stop. Another wonderful trait of Mrs. Piggle Wiggles is the interested way she listens to dreams. Now, every child in the world loves to tell what he dreams, and if the dreams don't seem to be quite long enough or interesting enough, sometimes some children work in old movies that they've seen or stories their daddies have read to them the night before. Dream telling is an innocent pastime and very good for the imagination, but unfortunately, dream telling usually occurs at breakfast, a time when daddies and mothers are slightly irritable and always in a hurry and no mood for long drawn-out stories of, "And then I was riding on this elephant and 2 Indians came up and tried to shoot me, but then I turned into a walnut, and dropped on the ground and said, About this time, mothers say, "Let's just let the dream go and finish your cereal." Or brother or sister will say, "Oh, you're just making that up. And anyway, it's my turn. Now I dreamed." Mrs. Piggle Wiggle not only listens to dreams, she asks about them right after school when the children come over to dig for treasure in her backyard. Mr. Piggle Wiggle was a pirate, and when he died, he buried his treasure in the backyard. Or they come to have tea or to play dolls. She'll say, "Anybody have any good dreams last night?" And they'll be off. Once, Molly O'Toole dreamed she was a raisin and was being eaten by a rat. Johnny Green dreamed that he was a pirate and lived in a whale. Hubert Prentice dreamed that he was an icicle and could freeze anyone he touched. Susan Gray dreamed that her dolls all came alive. Larry Gray dreamed he was a cowboy and had a white horse. Mary Lou Robertson dreamed that her covers were frosting and woke up with her mouth full of blanket. Kitty Wheeling dreamed that she was a movie star and had a real fur coat. Patsy said that she dreamed that she was an electric toaster, and everybody said she was making it up, and Patsy cried, and Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said she could help Patsy with her dreams. Some of the children's dreams were so long and dull and full of that Mrs. Piggle Wiggle finishes them off for them and says, "That was the way it was, wasn't it, Bobby?" Much to their evident relief. So you can see that loving children the way she does, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle just naturally understands them, even though they are being very difficult, which is of course why all the mothers in town call Mrs. Piggle Wiggle whenever they have trouble with their children. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle always knows what to do, and then of course she has a big cupboard full of magic powders and pills and appliances to help cure children's bad habits.